Content over everything!
I'll do the speech a bit later. I have some friends coming too. They would like to hear the speech. Okay, fair enough. So, what was I saying? And kids are educated in a way that makes them very too fragile to criticism, too fragile to a different opinion. Like, exactly, about education. Like, you can't tell a kid that he's being naughty even. You need to say, you're being silly. Because naughty is a very bad word. It's a very,
It's strange to me because we had 9 years of a conservative government, and you had Michael Gove as education secretary for a long period of time. So you imagine the education system. Like when I went to school, it definitely wasn't like that. Like maybe my school was different. I went to inner city London school. We definitely didn't have all this sort of mollycoddling and making sure everybody feels okay, everybody's a winner. We definitely had winners and losers. We definitely had people who had the top grades and people who had the lowest grades. All of that, it was never like, I don't know where this, that's what I'm saying. Maybe I'm woefully undereducated and I haven't been to school for a long time. Like, granted, I'm 29 now.
How long
so it's
ago
been a little while.
were you?
About 14 years now that I was in high school.
It's a pretty long time.
Yeah, it's a pretty long time. So I don't know, maybe, like I say, with 9 years of conservative education secretary, you would think that it wouldn't be this left wing. You would think during the time when I was at school, during the prime of the new year, Labour years, and going on to that, that's when you would have had all that left wing
I agree
stuff.
with you.
But I didn't have that.
Look, I agree with you completely. It wasn't like this just a few years ago. This change happened very suddenly, very quickly. And that's the strange part.
Yeah.
It's almost like somebody's trying to push an agenda.
But why would the Conservative Party be pushing an agenda?
Because
And
the Conservative
isn't
Party...
that more argument to vote them out? And
the
vote for
Conservative
Corbyn?
Party is not... There aren't complete factions. There are
Yeah.
many factions inside the Conservative Party
Yeah.
that probably want to take power from each other.
Yeah,
And
for
they
sure.
will use the enemies of the Conservative Party to do that.
For sure.
Like what I said about the migrants before. The Conservatives and the... I won't say the laborers, but the liberals usually nowadays have that ideology. The liberals say, "Oh, let's open the borders, let's let everybody in," because they want to get more people in the country that will vote for them and will be their pocket voters. I already spoke about it the other day. And the conservatives want the opposite. Seeing that there's still a majority of the same ethnic group in the country, they will use that to scapegoat basically the migrants and say, "Oh, those evil migrants, vote against them and we won't let anybody in. We'll keep them away." So basically the migrants are being used as a tool by both the sides. And it's not about good guys and bad guys. It's about who wants power and who's willing to do what for that power.
Yeah, no, for sure, definitely. I guess, but from the migrant perspective, you're going to go for the one who's going to be best for your position or point of view, right? So if you are a migrant and there's one party offering more favourable terms for migrants...
That's the genius of the whole situation.
100%.
Because long term, it's not beneficial for the migrants. Imagine this.
Yeah, for sure.
Imagine if the liberals win, not the liberals here, because the liberals here are pretty
They're
weak.
never going to win, yeah.
Yeah, in America, for example, in the US, imagine
Democrats,
the Democrats, the liberals win, and they open borders, everybody rushes in, population gets replaced. Fair enough. Everything, not fair enough, but whatever. It happens. It happened through history. It will happen. It might happen again. What happens then? They will treat their the new population, the newcomer population will become the new majority, the new population. And what makes you think that the liberals won't treat their newcomer, the new majority, the same way they treated the old majority, and won't bring even more new people, and will replace them again and again and
But
again
at that
and
point,
again.
that's when you see migrants starting to change their voting habits, and we see that quite often with quite a few established migrant groups. When they've been in the country for quite a long time, they start switching from the established liberal or left-wing vote, and you get more and more migrant communities willing to vote on the right wing because they feel like they're not more secure in their position than they should, and that's in their interest too. But I want to go more towards, because I think in that thing what you're pointing out is the dynamic of how political parties work and how they try and use populations or to in their favour to remain in power for as long as possible, basically. But the interesting thing is, I'd argue that this argument that we have a left-wing socialist education system, left-wing socialist
Not completely,
media,
but it's leaning that way.
I would say that argument there is definitely being used by parties on the right because it's a populist argument. It helps boost and make up the population at home feel insecure. No, your country's being taken over. And fear is a much better motivator quite often than hope. Quite often when people are afraid of things, they're a lot quicker to go out and vote and take action.
Yes.
And so I would argue that my experience isn't probably that dissimilar to anybody else's experience in terms of going to school and not having this whole quote-unquote left-wing thing. However, everyone leaves school and then they read these newspapers how everyone's a winner. There's this school that's doing this mad, outrageous thing that's like letting everybody like everybody gets A's and all this sort of random stuff. When you look at it in schools, most of the time, it's exactly the same as it's always been.
You mean in terms of grades? Or in terms of ideology? Or in terms of what they teach?
Ideology. It's never been a left-wing ideology. Like that whole idea has been put out there.
It's very Eurocentric, the educational system in Britain.
That's definitely true.
What makes it Eurocentric?
Well,
It's definitely Eurocentric.
No, the books
What
are,
makes it Eurocentric?
well, because the books.
So wait, guys, let me get this straight. You don't want the education in Europe to focus about the history and achievements of Europeans.
I would think,
You don't want that.
I would think education ought to be truth-centric as opposed to from a perspective or a point of view. Do you know what I mean? However, I do take it for, and I accept that for the purpose of nation building, if I had my nation, my politics are going to be Afrocentric or some at least leaning towards Pan-Africanism and that spectrum. However, if we're going to argue for what is the best outcome for truth, you would probably say, let's remove these sort of Eurocentric ideas that whitewash history and only make it one way, and let's try and look at history from a more wider point of view.
And what's the more wider point of view? Tell me a difference from the whitewashed history to the real history. Something that's whitewashed, and then tell me the real truth.
I suppose you get a character like Winston Churchill, right? And then you learn about him in segments and sectors.
The drunk.
There you go. But you don't learn about that part first. You learn about
Of course not.
a brilliant, amazing.
He was a symbol of resistance against the Germans.
There we go, and that's what is put across. That's the Eurocentric, whitewashed version of history.
Eurocentric.
But the reality is, he is a drug. He was
Hitler was
a
also
racist,
European.
a misogynist.
Well, wait, guys. How is one European opposing another European Eurocentric? It's just conflict between Europeans.
What making Churchill this great character?
So
When he was a supporter of empire, responsible for.
how is that Eurocentric?
Yeah, it is. Because it brings down other particular colonized territories in the world at that time, and even today, where it is said, because he's just said what he said, the other territories tend to be relegated to a secondary role in history.
Sure.
Do
you guys like Nelson Mandela?
That's what
I mean, he done some okay things.
Got some okay things.
I mean,
You think he was a completely good guy, like a great man, a hero?
No. I mean, I prefer, Nelson when he was a bit more,
A bit more what?
blowing things up,
No, I don't know. What do you mean?
No, when he was fighting, I'm joking about blowing things up, by the way. When he was more on the freedom fighter thing, basically, before he went to jail. When he came out of jail, and he was Mr. Peace, Mr. Nice Guy, the symbol, and he is used quite often as this symbol of, everybody loves everybody, the Rainbow Nation, let's all get along now. When really, prior to that, he was very much more a symbol of resistance and fighting for the rights of the indigenous, the Zulu, the Songa, and all the different groups of South Africa. Basically, he was far more representative of that. Do you know what I mean? And I think his wife Winnie Mandela, in contrast to him, I'm quite more of a fan of her. To be fair, she makes very very strong statements about Nelson, about how he came out of prison and forgot about the people in Soweto and all the people who were going through, and had literally lost people during the struggle for against apartheid. So yeah, I'm not a big fan of Nelson Mandela, but I definitely do see that.
Would you prefer him when he was more
his image has been used
active? Let's say.
I think it would have been better if he came out and he remained as active once he was as in power. Maybe active in a different way at that point because you have power. That you use it to actually make sure the finances and the wealth are redistributed across the nation, and that you don't have the same situation where political power seems to be transitioned from the minority into the majority group, but the wealth and the finances and all the controls of business still remain with the minority group.
Okay, let's make a direct parallelism with Nelson Mandela to something else.
And Churchill.
And Churchill.
To
a certain extent.
I mean, they both had used their image. But at the same time, quite a lot of the time, a lot of these public figures have their image presented for them after their death posthumously. For example, the example of Malcolm X. There's been a lot of conversation about him recently.
There's
a lot of
discussions about him,
Definitely.
about what he really means.
And that's
with
it,
his
exactly.
ideology.
That's the thing. People, after somebody dies, it's a lot easier for a lot of different groups to come out and say this person represented this.
To monopolize his ideology.
100%. So yes, so that sort of thing happens.
Issa will say that Malcolm X was brainwashed because he was Sunni. Shakara will say that no, he was he was a brother.
He was wrong. Yeah. You got to forgive and ignore Brother Issa sometimes, you know.
Brother Issa, the black intellectual,
the
black intellect. What do you think about that? That name, black intellectual, calling yourself a black intellectual.
Don't really have that. I mean,
that's what Issa calls himself.
Yeah, I know that's what he calls himself. I think he has his own reasoning for it. I'll let him explain it for himself. To be fair, I don't know.
What if I called myself a white intellect?
You could talk about it.
Would be pretty cringy, wouldn't it?
It would be a little bit more cringy, but I think that
a little bit more cringy, really.
But I think there's a thing, though, isn't it?
Okay, why more?
Is there not a dynamic, right? There's a dynamic between, for example, if someone comes here and saying there's black power, and someone's come here and saying white power.
What's the difference?
There's different dynamics, yeah.
What's the difference? What's the
difference? The history behind black power is about coming from a place of being disempowered, right? About a disempowered group coming out and trying to empower themselves and calling for black power, right?
Okay, so victory makes the whites evil.
Whereas, no. However, the expression of white power and the expressions of white power, how you doing?
He's got a new haircut, hasn't he? Sorry.
Of course.
He does. And the expressions of white power usually, historically, have been associated with the Ku Klux Klan and so on and so forth, which has been usually about the idea of white supremacy. So whereas black power has been about the idea of empowering a group that was seen as inferior up to a level of being level, white power has always been seen as or been associated with a group that was already superior, continuing on to push and press their superiority. Do you know what I mean? So it's like connotation and denotation.
But you would agree
right? So
that both people
the
who say white power and
power,
black power want the superiority of their race.
I wouldn't say that, no.
You wouldn't say that.
No, I would say
people
black
who
power.
say black power.
I say black power.
They
I would
aren't
say
claiming superiority of the black
100%
race.
no. I mean, I would say there's some amongst the group that might be. I would say
I don't see a very big difference. The quote seems the same.
Well, if I say black power, it's the same.
Are we still in a rush?
The denotation.
Are we getting bogged in?
No, you're talking about black power
Black power
and white power.
The denotation of black power and white power, I agree with you, have no difference. They're exactly the same. But the connotation is where the difference happens, right? What people hear and what they associate it with is what the issue is. Do you know what I mean? So
But the only difference I see is between the victor and the loser. Black people have been more oppressed through history than the whites by blacks, even though whites have been oppressed by blacks sometimes, and whites have oppressed themselves, and whites have been oppressed by East Asians, and East Asians have been oppressed by themselves. Everybody has been oppressed, and everybody has been the oppressor sometimes.
Yeah, for sure.
So, honestly, look, the ideology I try to get through here usually is that power has no color. It's about who has it.
100%.
It's not.
I would agree
matter
with
that much who has
analysis
the
of
color.
history completely.
And I don't think that linking color to power is a very good move. Honestly, it feels like Issa's compensating for something when he calls himself a black intellectual. Because if you need to put the name of your race in the word intellectual, it shows a very big insecurity in both your race and yourself.
That may well very be so. However, it comes down to what you were saying, right? It's about the winner, the quote-unquote winner and the loser, right? Or what some might be able to put a perpetrator and a victim to some extent, right? So when you do have a group of people or a situation who do come from that place of victimization, they may, like you're saying, exactly like you're saying, use these things to compensate, to say things like black power. And this is why it differs from white power. Because when you use white power, that's not about compensating for anything. That is a specific thing about oppressing, right? When we talk about black power, we are trying to empower a group of people up to a level.
Why are we trying to empower them?
Because they have been historically oppressed, and that's why when you say power has no color, I had to try and jump in there and disagree, because I agree with you that power has no color, and in our analysis of the history and how world and how power is used, we should try and rationalize it without necessarily always looking at color. However, if we ignore that color has played a role and that color has been used in the same way that if we ignore religion has been used, we would be really and truly, you're trying to set it would be setting black people up for failure, because black people have been oppressed throughout the past however many years, because specifically based on race, and the power of the other group has been consolidated around the basis of race. So for us to try and dismiss race out or color out of it is to really leave black people unhanded, and maybe that is the strategy and the plan by people always telling black people not to think about race or color. But really and truly, I would always encourage black people to think about race and colour, because, especially within power dynamics. I mean, and it happens on both sides. So on the right wing, people say it's not about race, it's about power. On the left wing, people say it's not
No, the
about...
right wing will say it's about race to themselves.
For some of them
because
will.
they lie on camera.
100%. And on the left wing, you'll have people that say it's not about race, it's about class. I would say to black people, both of them are lying to you, because in either situation, your race at some point is going to come up, and you're going to have to condemn with that situation.
Okay, let me ask you a question. Why do you think the Chinese and the Indians weren't enslaved like blacks by the whites during colonialism?
Why? I
Right,
think there's
yes.
many reasons. I think the nature of colonization was different. I think the appreciation and understanding of culture was different. But I also think there was a, there seemed to be a particular mislike of black people by the colonizers regarding
I understand your perspective.
for sure.
Now,
But and also, yeah.
let's think about it a different way. You know the Ottoman Empire, right?
Yeah.
The Ottoman Empire had soldiers, an elite caste called Janissaries.
Yeah.
Janissaries were young Christian boys
Yeah.
taken from Christian countries.
Yeah.
White guys
Yeah,
were taken and made into the elite of the Turkish army.
For sure, yeah.
Also, there were
I'm not sure for all my history in this one, but all the Janissaries white.
Huh?
Well, all the Janissaries taken from Europe.
mostly, almost all of them.
Yeah.
Almost all of the Janissaries were from Christian people.
Europe.
You know, some of them were from Armenia, for example. They were Christians in
Yeah,
Armenia.
for
Not
sure.
all of them were white like I am
Yeah,
white.
no, for sure.
But you know, if you look at the Middle Easterner, he's pretty close to what I am myself.
But the Ottomans had reach,
You know, except the hair color
north,
and eye
south, and
Yep.
east, right?
Now the
So-
Ottomans, that's the funny thing. Not only the Ottomans, but the Egyptians,
Yeah.
they also enslaved
The Mamluks.
blacks.
Yeah.
Exactly. They
Yeah,
didn't
for
only enslave whites; they also enslaved blacks.
sure.
Now, why did they enslave people from southern Ukraine, from the Balkans, from southern Russia, from sub-Saharan Africa, but they didn't enslave to such a great extent people from Italy, people from France, people from Germany, people from the Habsburg Empire. Let me ask you that question: why did they enslave specific people? Was it out of hatred for Ukrainians or for blacks or for whatever?
No, I would say probably in that situation around our circumstance. I'm not familiar with the history here, so I couldn't necessarily. I'm not going to try and make our position or argument down.
Or just
exactly
a
with the
hunch.
context of it. But yeah, no, my hunch would be situation and circumstance, right? So where the Ottoman Empire is located, and it straddles, like I say, all of that sort of Mediterranean, all the Mediterranean coast is almost. I'm not sure how much of influence they had on North Africa. I'm pretty sure they had quite a lot of influence.
Considerable.
on North
They
Africa.
defeated the Mamluks in Egypt, so they
100%.
took over
And so-
Egypt to that.
And within Egypt, I would say, once again, geography, etc., etc. And within Egypt, you would say, for example, they enslaved certain members of certain black people within Egypt, right? It wasn't necessarily every single black person across Egypt. It's not like they went into massive forays into Ethiopia or deep down into Sudan or.
I mean, it wasn't
all
as
across
massive
quite a
as
lot
when they went to Eastern Europe on raids, or the Crimean Tatars. They would they would go on raids and enslave people and sell them to the Ottomans.
For sure. So
Or
within
to
that.
row their ships.
So within that, so like you had the Italians and so on who seem to be safe from slavery. Like I said, this is all
Right.
theoretically. But I would argue that you would also would have had certain Amharas and Ethiopians who would have been saved, and Somalis and so on who would have also been saved from slavery
Not
during that period of
necessarily,
time.
but
As
go on.
But-
But look,
sure, as well as
what's the
Dinkas,
difference
yours.
between in that time between Eastern Europeans and Italians, for example? Why were one of them enslaved to a greater
You're going to tell
extent?
me, to be fair. Like I said, I gave.
Yeah, I
my-
am going to tell you, because Eastern Europeans didn't have an organized country to defend themselves. The Indians had a organized country, a united country. Usually they had a few different Rajputs, but none of them had absolute power over the other.
Yeah.
In China, there were different dynasties in China. In Japan, there was the emperor. In Africa, it was much more divided. There were empires, and those empires were sometimes at war with each other. And there were tribes, like for example the Zulus, who you definitely know about, who gave the most embarrassing defeat to the British in human history, honestly.
yeah, for sure.
When they beat with spears and shields and army armed with
You'd be surprised what you could do with a spear and a shield, man.
Yeah, no. But it was pretty embarrassing, honestly. Anyway,
yeah, for sure.
there were many different tribes, and they were not united. The whites enslaved the blacks because they could enslave the blacks.
Yeah, but this is the point I was making to you about, or I was attempting to make with my argument about the slaves that would have been taken by the Egyptians in terms of Abyssinia, Eritrea, and those sort of empires, which would have had a lot more organized state borders and power and defenses for themselves. However, I would agree with you that the lack of having organized structures within Africa definitely led to or allowed for colonization and conquest in Asia, as well as dividedness across the continent. But I think also the situation is the subcontinent of India is huge, right? It's massive, and it has an intricate history, right? Also, the continent of Africa is even bigger, right? It's much bigger. So
India.
the content, yeah. So the countries within that, like the several different countries within that even were forming and formed at different times, did form at different paces. So I'd agree with you. There would have been some countries that were in probably a more of a rudimentary state form, if we're analysing it from a quote-unquote Eurocentric perspective, than others. But even within that, like I say, it's not like, or as though, for example, Africa just fell like all at once. Do you know what I mean?
Of course.
It
wasn't like that. In the beginning, the Portuguese Empire was the first, and they only had like trading posts
100%,
around Africa,
100%.
where they wouldn't even enslave blacks. They would just buy off slaves for other goods.
I mean, with the Portuguese,
they didn't have the manpower. They didn't have the manpower.
I mean, they didn't have the manpower, but I mean, to be fair, some of the first trips, I think it was Henry the Navigator, is directly stated that his first trip before into Africa was a raid. However, I would agree.
They did do raids. You have no question about it. But mostly it wasn't.
There was an element of trading involved in parts of it. But say, for example, with the Songhai Empire, which managed to succeed for a long time, and even after it falls, its successor states managed to succeed for a long time and defend themselves from European colonization as well as Moroccan and Arab attacks.
Mozambique, when the Portuguese came there, it didn't fall at all. It remained independent for a very long time. It only traded with the Portuguese. Even though there was some, small
so you do see in Africa state structures. However, so therefore I don't think necessarily it's all about what state your state was at, as to how far your colonization went and how much slavery you experienced. Because prior to even Africans being taken as slaves, the Europeans and the Pilgrims of America tried to enslave Native Americans. And they tried to actually put Indians and Asians to work as slaves as well. They found it didn't fare as well as Africans, and actually quite a lot of Asians were imported out of India into places like South Africa to work as slaves. And there was it sounds contradictory right now, but that was actually what was happening to begin with. They realized that they didn't work as well, and
true.
Before people were treated
You're very right.
very
they
much as
tried
cattle
to
and
enslave
so on.
the natives in
100%.
Mesoamerica and South America, but they noticed they don't do such a good job in hard work.
100%.
And plus they died from plague very often. They weren't used to.
So the resilience of Africans played a big role in it, and how the European of the time viewed it as fodder, basically, as cattle, basically, as almost livestock that they were trading, and saying the most robust sort of unit of economic power was the black man or women, unfortunately. Do you know what I mean? And so that was how it was seen. And so I don't think it's necessarily all to do with Africa not necessarily having state structures. Like we said, there's many different places in Africa having state structures. But I think we would have seen similar if the roles were reversed and it was the Indians who were seen as being more robust and doing these works. Slavery might have taken place differently
I
than
disagree.
what happened.
There were other reasons.
I mean,
for example, concentration of population. In Africa, it was more dispersed. In India, it was more concentrated. Like, it's different to go to a village to kill a few men and take the rest of the people as slaves than to go to a big multi-thousand city with 100 men and try to take them as slaves. It's very different.
The geography of Africa definitely does lend well to slave raids and so on and so forth. But I don't think we can ignore the fact that there was a desire and a demand for African slaves specifically, and I think that demand plays a big role.
Thank you.
Everyone likes the army cut, but I don't think we can deny that part plays a role. And like I say, I think that it could have and would have been different. Like I say, even with the population differences, because Europe didn't necessarily, slavery was going on prior to this time, but Europe didn't necessarily take full control of these nations all at once. Even when it comes to India, right, the British Raj takes a long time to come about. From
in the beginning, India was colonized by the Portuguese, not by British at all. England was still far off from it. The world was divided between the Portuguese and the Spanish one time in the Treaty of Tordesillas. It did happen. But look, still, what I'm trying to go into here is
black power is a good thing. And white power because
no,
the
that's not what I'm going
connotations,
into. I don't think you should link power to color. I don't think it's a good thing even for black people to do. Because look, imagine this. Imagine from the perspective of all the other races. Okay, fair enough. Blacks have been enslaved. Yes, everybody knows about that. And then blacks say black power. We want power for us. But what you have to,
So the
you know,
consideration from black people.
yeah, you
should
need
be.
to earn that power. You don't
Yeah, for
just
sure.
say, okay, give me power, I want power.
For sure. For sure.
It doesn't work like that. You need to show that you're worthy of power.
For sure, there's no
And
doubt.
power, that's why power doesn't work by you
it's
claiming.
I don't think even power is about showing you're worthy of power. Power quite often is about taking it, you know?
Well, more or less,
Yeah,
more or less. It is about taking it.
That's it, for sure.
You
So
know,
I think
whether for better or for
so
worse,
possibly
it's about taking
black
it.
power could be a first step, because like you say, even if it is a matter of quote unquote compensating for something, right? That first step of I'm now compensating for the fact that I once felt inferior, that I'm now trying to do something now to feel like I'm no longer superior by pushing black power. That's a first step to striving for power, right? And that's something that we agree that is natural in the world. That all people.
Don't you think
and
that
all
will
people do.
create kind of some discrimination towards black people? If they say, oh, black power, we were slaves before, but now we're gonna rule, now we're gonna be the masters.
I am personally someone who is definitely a fan of, black people keeping our plans and our ideas necessary to
plans?
ourselves. If we're going to say black power and we're planning to enact on that and get power, it makes more sense for us not to shout out about black
Okay,
power.
so you're
right?
like a villain who keeps his, plan to himself until
a
the
villain?
last moment.
Why would I be a villain? Why can't I be a hero? You be the black hero. What's going on? What's going on?
True. The villain is the one who reveals his plan just to be stopped by the hero. If he
Exactly.
ends up winning, he becomes the hero, right?
That's it, exactly.
That's
The
it.
hero is whoever wins.
That's true.
But yeah, no, I think like you're saying, the very act of someone coming out saying they're black power can make other groups and other people feel insecure, and that insecurity can lead to counteractive.
It's not about insecurity. It's about look. It's simply about coexistence. If you claim, yeah, we're black power, we're superior, we're gonna be great, we're gonna be the masters soon. I don't think the others will,
Is it
will
masters
quite
soon?
follow you.
But we're just saying, yeah, we're just going to be empowered soon. We're going to be able to have our own businesses. We're going to be able to spend.
Okay,
our,
what do you think people will think that, okay, let's see, white power, racism, white superiority, whites are the master race, the others are shit, right? Black power.
Yeah.
Don't you think it will link a little bit to white power?
I think, unfortunately, people have made
Like
that
just
link.
the other way
I
around?
think, unfortunately, people have made that link. But I think if you look at all the examples of black power, it's very rare that you see,
Some examples, like what?
like for example, if you take the black power movements of the 80s, the 60s, 70s, and 80s, both even here in the UK and in the US, you very rarely see instances of violence or attacks or people trying to enact or enforce their power on other groups.
Okay.
Whereas when you have seen white power movements, Ku Klux Klan, neo-Nazis, and so on and so forth, it is a much more menacing, violent type situation. So I think if people were being fair and honest, and in the words you said, talk about coexisting, if people truly wanted to coexist, then I think they would show some understanding and actually look into the thing and say, you know what, actually there is a difference between when people talk about black power and white power. Actually, history has played a role in this, and there has been an effect on it. And black people, when they're trying to empower themselves, is actually not a problem or a threat to me, and I should probably either stand back and let it happen. But I suspect that possibly the issue is that people actually know that, or they threaten that black power threatens their market share of power. And if black people have more power, it means that white people have less power. So we have to do everything impossible to try and prevent black people from becoming empowered. And so we have to try and even twist the idea
I
of
hate
black
to
power
break it down to
into
you,
something
but
worse.
everybody pulls the blanket to their side.
For sure, definitely.
I want a good life for myself, you want a good life for yourself.
100%.
I mean, I don't feel like the white race is united at all. So I don't believe in ideas like white power. There is no white, unity.
Yeah.
As there's no black unity.
But, okay, cool.
It's
Let's
a
go
lie
back
to
to the
begin
conversation
with.
about Eurocentrism, right? If we bring it there, because this is where what Europeans are white people are united, right? Because they might not be. The idea of the West, for example, is a uniting idea, and within the West, there are many different factions. You have socialists, you have conservatives, and so on, who all speak about the West as something to uphold and to fight for and be proud of. So therefore, when we talk about white people aren't united, they are united around this idea of the West. Now within the West, there are
The West
divisions.
is not the only
are divisions.
faction amongst white people. And there are many
Is it
variations
Russia?
of the West.
Russia.
For example.
Okay, cool. I would accept that Russia is an exception to that ideology and idea. But even within Russia, I mean, I would say, what did Churchill say about Russia, right? Russia was a riddle wrapped in mystery signed by Enigma. It's a very difficult
Nothing
place.
mysterious about Russia. It's the rule by the iron fist.
It is the
That's
rule
why
by
the West
Iron
is
Fist, but in
better
terms
than
of
Russia.
its position of straddling both the Western and the Eastern world, and sort of its position of having its own unique empire historically to, for example, much of the West, the conquered West, has direct links to the very Latin world, the old Roman Empire. Now, whilst Russia also has links, their links are quite a lot more distinct to the West. Do you know what I mean?
For example?
And the way it's... So, how much was Russia under the Roman Empire?
Not a single day.
So there you go, that's what I mean. So it's very distinct. The development of the history and the culture of Russia was very distinct to the rest of Europe.
I would say it's more similar to the Mongolian Empire to Western Europe.
100%. So therefore, even though Russia is seen as a European nation, its history and the branches of where it's come from are very different to where the quote-unquote West is coming from.
That's what I'm saying too. It's very different. From
for sure.
So,
that's why I say Russia is a case apart in this idea. But I would definitely agree with you.
But they're also white.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. But I guess the thing about Russia is, okay.
So white power for Russia is something different than white power for the West.
Well, Russia and the West are definitely competing against each other for sure, right?
Of course.
Yeah.
And inside of the West, there's factions
definitely.
against each other.
I suppose from a Pan-African perspective, the analysis of Russia's position is we would definitely not see Russia as any different from the West, except for the fact that we've not had that much interaction with Russia throughout the period of colonization. However, throughout the period of post-colonialism and the Cold War, there was definitely a lot of interaction between Africa and
yes, because both Russia and the US tried to influence the colonies to support their ideology.
100%. And so from that perspective, I suppose as African, you would see that both of these groups are, even though they are at disagreement with each other, the political theories of Marx that influence and very much are behind, and a lot of the political theories of Russia are pretty much linked and tied to the political theories and philosophies of the West still. Do you know what I mean? So even though it's distinct from the West, they're still tied by those cultural ties. But when you get to the
Marx is
political
against
theories,
the West.
It's against, but they are tied.
Marx is the anti-West.
Of course.
You know what I mean?
But even within that,
he was created by the West, but he's not part of the West. He wants to destroy the West.
But it was created by the West, right? So it comes from that same core root. Whereas political philosophy of an African centre, or what Pan-Africans strive for, is political philosophy of an African centre, which would be
okay. Look at Idi Amin, for example. He's an African, but he supported Hitler.
Yeah, I mean,
so
Idi Amin done some interesting.
Sometimes we create what destroys us. It doesn't mean Idi Amin is part of the black. There is no black ideology, honestly, but it doesn't mean he protects the black people.
There's no black ideology when you say that?
Because there is no one black ideology,
Okay,
just as there is no one white ideology.
100%,
It's a silly argument to make that there is one.
There's not one. There's not one.
They're not united on anything.
But the collection of or the scale of ideologies within the West, or within the frame of the West, quite often, I say Russia would even be included within that. And I suppose from a Pan-African perspective, we would not be on that frame or on that scale. I think that's where it's coming from. I was coming from.
So what frame would you be on?
I would say the unfortunate situation, which we, like you say, is history. History is conquest and men going to war, basically. But the most recent period of history, and I would say, one of the most savage and most upsetting situations, which was the conquest of Africa and the colonization of Africa, has left us in a situation where the political theories and the ideologies that actually rule and shape the world in a way that was not possible in previous years or previous conquests, right? So even though Rome was able to massively shape the world and the politics at its time, you know, if you're living in South Africa at the time, it has nothing to do with you, right? However, with the new age politics that we have today, the political ideas of the West now permeate through everything that we do. So from the Bretton Woods institutions to the UN, all of these things are pretty much skewed towards the ideologies and ideas founded by people in the West who, come directly from the West.
Okay, but what's the problem with the ideas of the West? If they are functional, why don't you just adopt them?
Because we've tried that, right? So after post-colonial...
we
did.
No,
Post-colonialism.
No.
Post-colonialism is a sad example of attempts of Africans trying to implement Western systems into Africa,
yes
right?
and no.
So look at the Caribbean, right?
What happened was that both the sides of the Cold War tried to use the Africans as a tool for their own ideology. It wasn't trying to kind of convert them, to bring them together in their ideology or in their empire. It was just abusing them and using them for their own means.
Both sides of Europeans,
It's not acceptance.
For
In
sure.
the Roman Empire, in the beginning, of course, they killed many people, they enslaved many people, but eventually, towards a certain point in the Roman Empire, every single citizen in the part of the Roman Empire was considered a Roman, whether black, white, or East Asian, even though there weren't too many. Whatever. That was the right way to go.
I mean,
so why are you so adverse against European ideologies?
But I mean, because now the European Empire has done it like Rome, did they? It's not like Britain brought in people from Africa and said, you're British now, you're a Britishman, right? Quite often there's quite a very clear distinction between who you were and what you were, and even after periods like slavery, it was a very harsh reality for those people. So to ask us to try and adopt a British thing that was never really offered to us anyway is it's strange, right? It's not something that really can work. At least Rome made an attempt to make their conquered people feel at home, right? That was never really the case. So I don't think it makes sense for anyone to ask us to do that, and it doesn't make sense for us to even do that. I don't think any of us are really even interested in doing that. And it does make sense for us to actually go back and say, let's found and think of ideas of our own. Now, we have idea of, take the good and leave the bad, right? It's a very, very common saying across cultures, right? So there's no issues. You've got many Pan-African groups who've taken on things like socialism and social ideas. You've got Pan-African ideas. You've got Pan-Africans who've taken on liberalism and even more conservative ideas. However, what they all agree on is the idea and the need to, one, go back to their own foundation, their roots of their own culture and where it comes from, and two, that all of these ideas are useless unless implemented with it in building a nation of their own, which they have the control over for themselves. And like I say, the exact example of the Cold War was the implementation of different people. But even in places, just say for example Jamaica, for example, Russia never really had much of a big influence there. It was all Britain and then America, basically.
The Soviet Union had
not a big influence.
I guess,
I guess
it
wasn't a big influence.
Jamaica,
Jamaica. I mean, in Grenada, they had an influence.
In Cuba, they had a huge influence.
Cuba, they had a big,
but in Jamaica,
big
I guess you're right. Yeah.
Exactly, but in Jamaica, you have this Westminster democracy there, and when you look at it, it's completely unfunctional with the culture and the people that it applies to, and so you have all these things around corruption, all these sort of things that would probably, I would argue, not be there if they had a political system that was more aligned to the culture of the people and recognize those things. A political system for them, right? You want me to propose one right here, right now? I mean, I'm good. I'm not that good. I'm not that good of a political philosopher, but I would argue that, for example, I think this is something that is quite. It's been even written about by even Western scholars when analysing African politics and quote unquote this idea of the big man politics, basically. This idea that you have these big people who are big chief type characters who end up controlling large swathes of power within the politics, and because of that, that's why you quite often had Western powers backing these powers because they thought they were more stable in position, right? I feel like if you have your political system that recognize some of these people, because they're not just presidents, right? Quite a lot of these people are chiefs, right? Village chiefs who are not recognized in any way by
the current leaders in Africa.
No. The current leaders might be a president, but just say a leader somewhere in a district somewhere.
Leaders are usually dictators.
Yes, no, the current leaders are usually dictators. But I'm just saying, say for example, you have this quote unquote parliamentary system somewhere in Africa, right? Then you have this big village chief who for past hundreds, so many years, him, his grandparents, great-grandparents, all of them have been the village chiefs of those areas. They managed to, they can have a massive influence on the politics of the nation, right? And they're not recognized by the system that's been imposed on them because the system of this Westminster democracy doesn't have space for village chiefs and stuff like that, right? So the democracy ends up getting circumvented by these chiefs who are able to get money, bribes, all these types of things, and influence politics massively because it's not recognized. So if you had a political system, which like when you think about it, Westminster democracy is tied specifically to the culture of Britain, right? The culture of the UK, the Glorious Revolution, all of these types of things, all of the acts of Parliament, all the powers that Parliament have are tied to specific points of history in the UK. So try and take that system and impose it on someone that doesn't have the history, it is completely nonsensical. And so that's why I would argue that Pan-Africanism is, of course, the way to go.
Okay, look, you've got a point that some systems will not function in other places with other people.
Yeah.
You got a point there, it's true. Because necessities are different from place to place, like the way of life is different. But if you want to separate from a certain system, you need to make something functional to go to.
Yeah.
You shouldn't just, we're gonna separate, we're gonna be independent, and what you're gonna do after you're separate.
For sure. I mean, that's definitely something that you could choose when you have the benefit of space to think about it, right? The issue with independence for Africa is they literally had to fight off their colonizers and their oppressors in order to get independence. And then they were born into an era.
Nowadays, there's no.
No. I was talking about independence. So when you got independence Africa, when they actually had the opportunity to create something of their own, it's not like they were sitting there under the rule of Britain and thinking, we have all the time in the world to sit around and think of the perfect system that we're going to have once we get independent. They literally had to fight for independence. When they got independence, it was like, okay, let's try and build a system here. And a lot of them, there was coups and all sorts of counter-revolutions that happened as a result of that in the aftermath. In the nowadays, I would definitely agree with you that we definitely do need more philosophers to build on the work that other Pan-Africanists and other scholars have already done to really create that actual functional system for people to go to. But the issue is, you can't really... Creating a big system is one thing in practice. I mean, in theory. Then at some point, it has to come to practice. And that will... So
what do you need to create that? What kind of resources do you need to... What lacks? What does what do the African countries lack to create that new system that they're going to follow instead of the Western systems that you say are incompatible with
What do they like right now?
Well, yeah. Well, what do they need?
I would say what they need. I'd probably say space and a little bit of freedom, but I think they're probably not going to get that from, I guess, global and corporate interests that are interested in the resources and basically resources. Right?
Well, look, corporal interests aren't about race; they're about corporation.
Exactly, 100%.
There's something new because look.
I would argue not really. I'd say that some of the first corporations that we saw were incredibly.
It's very new. It's very recent.
At
least the huge power they have nowadays. Something very recent. Like capitalism has existed since the Industrial Revolution, basically.
I would say, prior to that, to be fair, you had big
capitalism needs.
You had big companies, raiding and trading for slaves off of Africa, right?
Yeah, but
big corporations, and they were trading people.
Exactly capitalism.
It was a rudimentary form of capitalism.
Fair enough. It was like the beginning,
for sure.
during the colonialism.
So
because there was a concentration of
race.
factories, of workshops.
You got tied to race. You can't get away with that.
It's tied to race.
Well, it's beginning. The roots of it, at least, are rooted there. At that point.
Look, again, I don't think black people got enslaved because they were black. They got enslaved because they could be enslaved. If it were other people, look, Ukrainians got enslaved by the Turks because the Turks could come there and enslave Ukrainians.
For sure, that may well be the case. But the system that definitely developed was definitely race-based after a point.
Oh, eventually, of course.
For sure.
Because if you are enslaving another person, you need to keep the ideology that person is inferior, or else you might feel bad for the person. And how will?
But not even just that. We can't also.
They developed race.
We can't
deal with such a great amount of slavery.
Early Europeans who once they arrived in Africa and the Native Americans and places like this, many of their writings made it very clear how they viewed the people. It was like, these people have so much and they give us so much. I can't remember, I think it was Christopher Columbus talking about the Native Americans, how they brought him food and they gave him spices and all these sorts of things for free. He didn't have to give them anything for it, they just gave it to him as gifts. And he was like, these people will make perfect servants. So right from the off, the idea was, these people are different to us people.
Are you talking about Cortes and the Aztecs, or are you talking about any specific example?
No, I think that was Columbus.
About Christopher Columbus, how the natives gave them some food.
Yeah, for sure. Food and so on. And so they're saying, it was very clear right from the start of thing of, we are our people, they are their people, and
who, the whites?
The white people, we are the white people, and they are the Aztecs and the Native Americans, and they are so nice and gullible.
Situation, by the way.
Okay, it's separate.
It's very different.
But these guys, the Aztecs were a bit more on this thing. But
no, look,
until Montezuma,
it's not about that. Look, the Aztecs, Montezuma, they're
snaked them, to be fair.
Huh?
He snaked them, to be fair.
He did what?
He snaked them.
Snaked them?
Yeah. He ended up representing more of a Spanish agenda. There was a few Montezumas, to be fair.
It was because the Aztecs were very superstitious, and the arrival of the Spanish coincided with the supposed arrival of Quetzalcoatl. their, the plumed serpent, and they were kind of thinking, oh, these very different people, there might be a, God, and the gods might have sent them, that it's a message, blah blah blah. So it would be against their belief to just slaughter them.
Yeah,
But the Aztecs used to do that. They would fight against other tribes. It was just because the Spanish were very different, were something very foreign, like the horses and the gunpowder. Just because of that, did they have any mercy upon them? If they were like the other tribes, they would fight them, they would enslave them, and they would sacrifice them. That's what the Aztecs did with the other tribes. That's why they were hated by the other tribes.
I have to do a bit more research in that area, but definitely. From what I'm familiar with, that's definitely.
You know about the ritual sacrifices, right?
Definitely.
Ripping of hearts.
But like I was saying, there was definitely a viewpoint of the European explorers, though, of our people and other people out there. And when they discovered other people,
Everybody has it.
100%. So that's why we can't separate the racial element from this early beginning, this rudimentary form of capitalism. Do you know what I mean? Of the trade of people, of resources. It's this trilateral trade that developed from America to Africa, to India even, and Europe. We can't ignore that race.
We need to separate them because the two things aren't necessarily together. We have capitalism nowadays, and we don't necessarily need slavery. First of all. Secondly of all, slavery existed way before capitalism.
A different form of slavery.
It wasn't formed by capitalism.
Yeah.
It was just, to have capitalism, you need to have a huge amount of production. Seeing that they didn't have machines, a huge amount of production would be done by slaves to a great extent, right? But just because the two coincide doesn't mean they necessarily have anything to do with each other. Capitalism needed a huge production, and slavery allowed that production. That's why they're linked together. But I think it's a fake.
I don't think capitalism is necessarily bad because it started in whatever form it started in. Do you know what I mean? I don't think necessarily that's what makes capitalism bad. I think there's some other things that might make capitalism bad, but not necessarily the way it started. But I definitely do think that the way it started, it does play a role, especially in our understanding of the world today, global politics and economics, and how things stand, right? So it's very difficult. So for example, when we talk about Eurocentric history, just to bring the conversation all the way back to the start, you get talked about the Industrial Revolution, we get talked about it separately from America, not just American, but British exploitation of the world, and a lot of the funding and the wealth and the resources that allowed people to actually live in a society where you can sit around, where you can have people go to all these universities and these colleges, which were a lot of them funded by slave owners, right? So a lot of the back of Industrial Revolution and so when people, and quite often people use that as a context to say Africa is poor because they didn't industrialize enough, and they ignore the fact that, well, during the Industrial Revolution, Africa was massively under colonization.
Okay, look, you're right. So the two things coincide, but it's not a consequence relation. It's not because of slavery that capitalism started existing. It's because of the greater amount of production that the capitalism started existing. Whether it was because of slavery or because of something else, it wouldn't matter.
It wouldn't matter,
just about
but the fact
production.
that it happened is significant.
There were slaves before capitalism. The nobles, again, the nobles.
The chattel slavery was.
It's fine. I'll give you the example of the Portuguese. The Portuguese and the Spanish had a much worse management of the wealth they acquired from their empires.
Yeah.
They would just sell the gold into Europe, and have their
nice
nobles and their have their kings and nobles and blah blah blah, have a very luxurious life and parties everywhere,
they were
fancy
messing
food.
up. The Portuguese
Now
were
the
messed
British
up.
had a much
more
more
systematic.
practical understanding of all of that. That's why the merchants eventually took a lot of power from the nobles because they could manage that wealth better.
For sure.
You know what I mean? It's nothing to a certain extent personal against specifically Africans that they were enslaved in that moment. It's because they needed workers, and it wouldn't matter where those workers came from. It would be irrelevant. Like in the Romans, again, the Romans, they would enslave the people they would conquer.
But I agree. Whether it's not
race.
No,
they would still see them inferior, like barbarians,
I think that's possibly the case. However, I think it's quite difficult to tell African people that's not personal, because it feels quite personal when it does happen to you, right? So if you're colonized, you're going to feel, and the entire system is started from that root. Even though we could say it could have started any way, it didn't, right? At the end of the day, it didn't start any other way. It started because the mass production that was increased came through chattel slavery in a way that was never possible before. And so we can, and to some extent, it can feel to some extent dismissive to try and say, it doesn't matter where it started, because because okay, it does matter because that's how it started. Do you know what I mean?
Sure.
And it's like in history, sometimes we do. And I think this is where Eurocentrism comes in.
Practice in their countries.
Yeah, for sure, definitely.
So what's the issue?
No, I don't think that's the issue. But I think the issue is that whether we can accept this Eurocentric version of events where capitalism, all these sort of things happen ahistorically and they're just on their own, or where we actually accept a more well-rounded version of history where we say, actually, you know what, capitalism and the Industrial Revolution, all these sorts of things actually did come around from a place in time in history, a point in history, and a lot of those things actually do have consequences, not just these good consequences that have led to, you know, trains and railroads and stuff like that, negative consequences as well.
Of course.
And I think that makes. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, of course. I'm not denying that. I'm not denying there were negative consequences. Like in the Industrial Revolution, the very Europeans, the poor, the poorest of the Europeans were basically slaves too. They were working in factories. I mean,
but even
officially
some of them
they
were
called
able to buy
slaves,
shares
but
and stocks in slave
it was
ships.
the same. It was the same kind of hard work. They would work like 12, 13 hours per day, whatever, in really polluted environments. Like women, children would work and would get paid less.
Definitely. No, I would definitely agree with that. But I mean, the interesting thing is,
wasn't about
there's
race.
even
I don't think
documentaries.
it was about
But there's
race.
even documents that show that even those of very poor were able to buy shares in either or shares on insurance on slave ships, and within slavery, you had people from working class families even getting payouts from slavery. So even though it might not have been about race, having a specific type of being British and white British, even if you were working in a coal mine, you had a chance, more of a chance than if you were on a slave ship
to a certain extent, again, because of what I mentioned before. If you are enslaving a huge amount of a population of people, and that population has a specific cosmetic qualities, and you need to keep them as slaves, you create an ideology that shows them as subhuman.
Yeah, definitely.
So you can use them better as tools.
Sure. But I think there's also
that's
a matter
how
of
slaves were seen for the Greeks, for the Romans, for all the slaves, for the Egyptians.
But at the same time, I think I do agree with you that there was an ideology created. But at the same time, I think there's also a natural thing created. There was a natural reaction that happened. So if you read some of the first stuff, I think what's his name? Because he has a travel agency. I can't remember what it's called, but he was a Christian traveller back in the day, traveled through Africa, and he was quite appalled to see Africans. He was so shocked when he saw Africans for the first time that it made him question his whole faith and ask, how can these black people come from Adam, right? So as much as I agree with you in terms of that this racial thing has come on and it needs to be put on to justify a thing, there's also a certain reaction from Europeans as well that was already there and inherent. In the same way, Native Americans saw Europeans coming and they thought, these guys are cool, or some of them thought these guys are cool, or these guys are the chosen ones.
With
100%. And the same when
gunpowder
Africans
weapons would look like magic.
welcomed Europeans into Africa and gave them and were really willing to trade with them. Europeans all had a different sort of reaction to outsiders, and I think it's probably based around issues around climate and things around that, and the historical perspectives in which you take a demonized culture. I think probably if you live in somewhere in Africa where you have a mass amount of land, you could easily spread out, and you can probably grow food a bit easier in different areas. You don't have a harsh winter to compete with. You're probably a lot less harsh to strangers because you don't view them as a threat to your land. People in general.
Okay, so you want to say by that white people are more racist than the others?
No. I'd say that the natural
Europeans treat others differently than Europeans are treated. Is that what you're saying?
I'm not going to say that Europeans are treated. I say that the reaction of Europeans, early reaction of Europeans to outsiders can't be ignored, especially when you start comparing it to other groups. Do you know what I mean?
I don't think the Europeans had a negative reaction of the Chinese Empire.
Possibly not.
I think they might have had a more negative experience of the Africans, because there were, as I said, they were more separated.
Yeah, for sure.
There were, on one side, there were empires and cities. On another side, there were villages and tribes and nomads and blah blah blah. That could be much more easily enslaved than those big cities with lots of people and an organized system.
Yeah, for sure. But I think it's about the initial reaction, the idea of these guys couldn't have come from Adam sort of reaction. It's more what we're talking about rather than the same response. So yeah, I think that's another discussion for another day, to be fair.
Did he explain the exact reasons for why he said they could come from Adam?
I think
was it poverty?
Their skin, the color of our skin, how we looked mostly.
Ah, because they're black. Is that it?
Yeah, mostly how we looked.
Well,
parents' hair.
It's possible. Yeah. That's a possibility. Definitely.
Sure. But
True.
I mean, but these are. For me, I don't think these are things that we should be afraid or even worried to talk about or discuss. Do you know what I mean? Especially in terms of.
No, I don't think we should be afraid of discussing it. I just don't think we should throw around quotes like white power or black power. I don't think it's functional for any of the different races. I think nowadays, especially, it's not a very beneficial thing. Like in those days, again, as I already explained, why probably the ideology of racism was eventually coined to be able to oppress the slaves better. You know, like again, we go back to the Romans one more time. To the Egyptians, we can go back to the Egyptians as they enslaved the Jews, who were a different race. You know, and eventually it is a historical fact. Even though I don't believe in the Bible and the Torah, all that stuff,
I
but
do.
they did enslave the Jews.
Because
of an ethnicity, you know.
They
were a different race, basically.
Let someone else debate that part.
I would say they're a different ethnicity. They're not like there's different ethnicities of Jews. I don't put all the Jews together,
100%.
but in those days, those specific Jews enslaved by Egyptians probably had the same ethnicity. I think we can.
What would it have been?
Argue for that.
Would it have
It's
been?
difficult to say. It's pretty difficult to say what exactly they were.
Because Abraham married an Ethiopian Jew, right?
I don't know about Abraham.
Yeah, I believe he
I
married.
know mostly about
Noah
the
married
Jews
an Ethiopian
enslaved
Jew.
by the Egyptians. They were called.
Or maybe an Egyptian woman actually had one, yeah. And I think Noah had an Ethiopian wife. Quite a few of the Bible guys.
I don't believe in Noah. Sorry.
Quite a few of the patriarchs of the Bible had African.
Look, I don't know about Abraham, and Noah most definitely didn't exist. There is absolutely no historical records of Noah, or of his ark, or of anything that happened there.
Yeah, for sure.
So we're not gonna have any. What's up, bro? We're not gonna have any similarities in speaking about that specific part. But you know, about Jesus, for example, he did exist. Muhammad, even though I don't believe in me, he did exist as a man. Same with Jesus again. But yeah, look, there has been discrimination all throughout history, and it's true that if we are trying to pinpoint it, we can pinpoint some parts of history when it existed a lot more. But I don't think it's a fair thing to say that whites have been Eurocentrism, white people, they're just racist. Because it hasn't been like that. Again, in the Roman Empire, it hasn't been like that at all. The Romans discriminated on people based on their civilization.
For sure.
Civilizations they deemed worthy, they respected them, like the Greeks, or to a certain extent, exactly the Egyptians, who were considered as the most important region of the Roman Empire. I mean, after Rome. In the Middle East, they had relative respect for the Middle Easterns, even though they didn't like some of the ways of ruling themselves. They disrespected the barbarians, like the Gauls.
Here's where I would agree. I would say, here's where I agree with you, especially in terms of white power and black power. I would personally say that I would not have an issue myself if somebody wanted to go around screaming white power, white power, white power. That's up to them. That's their prerogative.
I mean, I wouldn't just start telling them to shut up, but I would just be like, okay, whatever.
In regards to black power, I definitely see it and view it differently, and I think most people do because of the connotations. Like I explained, it's coming from a different place. I mean, the history of black people shouting out black power has been about fighting for civil rights and all these types of things, as opposed to fighting for extra rights above anybody else. However, I would say in this day and age, the most important thing that we need to do as a community is work, and I agree with you that power doesn't come from simply attaching yourself to a color or by arguing people saying I'm black, give me power, right? Power comes from being in a position where you put yourself in a position, either economically, socially, etc., to actually exert and use influence and power for whatever you
about
think.
Martin Luther King?
I'm a fan of Martin Luther King. I think he was a nice guy. I think his last speeches were probably better in my opinion than some of his early ones. But I think he made a comment about his fear. I think integration is one idea, right? Talking about let's try and integrate our people. On the other hand, I think when we're talking about this idea of power, integration only takes you so far regarding power, right? And I think it makes a lot more sense.
It gives you, look, in a democratic society, integration allows you the possibility of striving for power as well as the rest of the population.
For sure. But
It's the greatest power you guys could achieve.
Only to a certain extent.
The same power
No, I would argue the greatest power that we could achieve.
So for me, Martin Luther King is the best example of a good, idol for black people to follow.
But remember earlier we were speaking about remember earlier we were speaking about Western and Russian. I'm going to throw in there Chinese as well, because China's one of the superpowers, right? I would say the best power we could possibly hope to achieve for is to have a political power equal or above the United States of America in the global south or Africa, as an example. That is what I would say it makes more sense for us to strive for. And integration doesn't necessarily get you that. Integration helps you make America great. Integration might make you make Britain great. It might help you make China great if you integrate into any of those countries. But it's not necessarily going to help make Africa great. And I think the thing that's going to make Africa great is a focus on creating actually African-owned nations that are ran on African indigenous systems, rather than these systems that are tied to, previous colonizers or some strange Cold War hangover. Do you know what I mean?
That's a good.
Yeah. So I think that's the best power that we can strive for. But however, I'd say if we're here in the UK, I would say it would make sense for us while we're here in the UK to partake, to not, upset the apple cart too much, and keep a main eye focused on our home countries and improving and building those up to better positions of power. Because I think you'll have more power.
There's a problem in that argument. Look, Ukraine is in a bad situation right now. You probably know about it. If I want to help Ukraine, I can, speak about Ukraine. I can spread awareness about what's going on in Ukraine, but it's not going to help. All it's going to do, it's going to spread awareness so people know about the hypocrisies about, for example, international help. Why are the Americans helping actively Syria but not helping Ukraine? Because in Syria they have their interests, and in Ukraine they don't have their interests. You know what I mean? Why did they accept refugees from the Middle East, but not from Ukraine? Because nobody gives a shit. The refugees have a political use for the people who are accepting them. That's why they accept them.
So Russia didn't accept them? Russia won't take Ukraine refugees?
Oh, they would take like the Russian ones, but not the Ukrainians, of course. The pro-Russian. You need to be pro-Russian. Poland accepted a bunch of Ukrainian refugees, a considerable amount, but besides Poland, nobody even spoke about them. And there were many. There were a lot.
Why is the rest of Europe so silent and ignoring this?
Because nobody gives a shit.
Because there's no power, there's no gas under Ukraine or anything.
Well, exactly.
Fair enough.
Exactly. It's not only about the gas. If they cared about the gas or oil in the Middle Eastern case, they would invade to get it. That's power. 100%. They invade to get what they want and then leave. Exactly, to make them a puppet. It's not personal in terms of race. It's all about the structure of power. It's all about gaining more power.
I would definitely say that power plays a role. I definitely say power doesn't play a role in it.
No, I think power is the only role that is relevant enough for people to discuss, but they don't want it. They want to focus more on, my race is being oppressed. My religion, Christophobia, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism.
All these things play a role in it, because people use all these types of things as tools of power, right?
Of course they're tools,
100%.
yes. But they're all to hide the actual structure of power.
For sure.
What was not fought for religion or for
just say, for example,
race or whatever.
On the power table, right, the political power table, you do have people at the top of those tables, right, who tend to have races and religions. And
they use them as tools.
They might use them as tools themselves. However, just say, for example, I'm a black guy at the table. I doubt there's that many black guys at the power table, to be fair. If there is a black guy,
I disagree.
Obama might have been the one. Obama might have been the one.
You'd be surprised. There might be a few.
Who else?
Huh?
Who else?
Well, for example, the dictators in the African states.
I'm not sure they're at the table. I think they're under the table. I think somebody's pulling their string. But,
well, you might have a point, but still, who is living a luxurious life in Africa as the people are suffering?
100%.
Dictators.
100%.
Who is building a road from the palace to the airport in case things go sour?
Exactly.
Dictators.
Exactly. That's the whole point, right?
Yeah, exactly.
How comfortable are you if you need that road? You're not that comfortable. The guys who are right at the top table and the puppet, they don't need no roads to the airports. They're comfortable wherever they are. You don't even know who they are, probably.
Well, yeah, to a certain extent, you're right.
So I'd agree with you that you do have those people. And I'd agree with you that even to the people at the table, race probably to them doesn't have any role factor at all. But the fact that the table doesn't have anybody who happens to be black, it just means my position and our position in the community is even more detrimental because for us to have any power,
race is irrelevant.
we have to band towards one of these other power players who are already at the table, or we band together and get one of our own power players at the table.
I understand why some people here think that if they defend this idea of black unity, of Pan-Africanism, of black power, it will empower them because it sounds nice, it sounds like they will have some power. But nobody will take you seriously. Nobody will give you power because you're black. And nobody will, blacks won't unite just because they're black. They have different ideologies, man. I will not unite with Russians because, not with the government of Russia. Many Russians are against the government.
Who would you unite with?
Who would I unite with? With the West, of course.
There we go, right? And that's
Of
what
course, but not
Pan-Africanism...
with-
Pan-Africanism
But it's not because of race, man.
But Pan-Africanism
Because of ideology. I didn't identify myself with their ideology.
100%. But the West is a Eurocentric ideology, right? The ideologies of the West are they're all Europeans. They all come from European ideas. They're all tied to European history.
You can use a Western
That
ideology
alone-
in your country. And that's exactly what's happening right now.
You could.
They're using socialist ideologies
And it's
in
not
Africa.
Going, it's not that great.
It's not going
exactly.
well,
So
yeah.
it'll be
But
better,
if they use
it'll be better for
democracy
them.
in Africa without,
No. Democracy, baby.
no. What do you want them to use?
We had democracy
Have
in
a
Africa
plan,
for
man.
many
You need
years.
to have a plan. You don't have a plan.
No, we do have plans.
What's the plan?
The body of thought, that's what people might not understand. That's what I'm trying to get at, right? You said you're with West. That's why I asked you, who would you associate yourself with? You wouldn't do it on colour, you do it on ideology and the ideology of the West. That's why the West itself is a body of ideologies that are tied
Yes,
towards
I would choose
history.
specific
And
ideologies
so
in the
therefore,
West, not all
what
of them.
Pan-Africanism tries to do, let's say, just say, for example, you have the West. Let's say we have the South, right? Africa and the South, the global South, right?
South
so what we're
Africa,
trying to do is
or
create,
just
no, the
Sub-Saharan
South,
Africa?
no, the South, like
Okay,
the global South,
the
right?
north, the south.
So what we're trying to do is try and create the South, rather than opposed to the West, we create a South, and the political ideologies of the South will be tied to Pan-African ideas and ideas of Africa. Now, some of them might take good ideas.
What
some
are
of the best
Pan-African ideas?
Well, there's quite a few to be fair.
For example, give me one example.
Would you want Uhuru? Ubuntu, sorry, Ubuntu.
Okay, go ahead.
Ubuntu.
Give me like the basics of its ideology.
The basic philosophy of Ubuntu is I am because we are, basically. It's
What does it mean?
it's actually probably a bit older than Plato's I think, therefore I am. But it's basically the fundamental principle of how Africans
Like
view.
Descartes, I think, therefore I am.
Yeah, Descartes, yeah, basically. But I think it's more, sorry, yeah, I said Plato, Descartes, yeah. But it's basically around the idea of we are because we relate to other people and how we relate around to our community group around us. So I am because we are. So it's the idea that all the Bantu people are connected and interlinked, and what is good for all the Bantu, for one Bantu person should be good for all, and what should be bad for one Bantu person should be bad for all. And that's a political philosophy.
But only Bantu people.
I mean, to be fair, that's where from my understanding of the philosophy, that's where it comes from. I'm not sure. It might apply wider. But I'm pretty sure when the philosophy came about, they wasn't necessarily thinking, because Bantu just means people, like I think, or person, I think.
Yeah, but it's linked to ethnicity of blacks.
Of course, now it's linked to ethnicity black, but in the initial language, lexicon of the language of the Bantu people, they would have just been referring to people in general. Do you know what I mean?
So you think it's
even amongst Bantu people, you have various different tribes, right? Or various different Bantu groups. Like Zulu is a Bantu group, right?
Sure.
So
you think you could use that ideology to unite the different African ethnicities?
We could use that partially, and that has been attempted, and there are attempts in the process to expand on that political ideology. And so you'd use something like Ubuntu, and you would couple it with perhaps theories of government and things like this. So you start looking at it from a more indigenized point of view. So you can say, okay, so already, how did politics work in Africa prior to colonization? What systems of government did we have then? What systems of the governments remain now as hangovers, even despite colonization? So we have systems of tribal chiefs and things like that, right? So you say,
so you want to come back to that system?
But how would we integrate those systems into
exactly.
in a modern era?
Changed.
100%. But that's why it's the work of Pan-African philosophers to think that through fully. And so if you ask me, do we have a ready political philosophy to go? It's probably not 100% ready right now. However, there are various different types at different stages. The issue is implementing these political ideologies. One takes a non-corrupt leader of a nation, and two, will probably take other people not intervening in those countries. Because if you have a leader trying to take control of his nation, trying to make the nation best for the people of that population, you're going to have somebody saying, hey, yo, I used to get gold from you guys for the cheap. I still want it at the same price. I used to get coal from you guys at the cheap. I want it at the same price. And as they don't get it at the same price, they might start backing, first of all, anti-PR campaigns and things like that. And if that doesn't work, they might start backing coups. Do you know what I mean? So the position for us to develop proper Pan-African ideas is a hard one. It's a difficult one, notwithstanding, but it's one that we have to do, in my opinion, because I don't think any implementation of Western ideas just into Africa, just like that, is going to help or be beneficial for Africans.
For example, if we think of democracy, do you think it's incompatible with Africa?
I don't think democracy in itself is a Western idea. I think
it is, but why is it incompatible?
No, I mean, okay, Athenian democracy, right, is a Western idea, right?
Well,
so,
Athenian democracy includes slaves, and it only gives the vote to citizens.
It, exactly. So we don't even have Athenian democracy here. So the root of democracy
I'm not talking about the Athenian one, though. I'm talking about modern democracy.
It's not, exactly, but it's not just a Western thing, right? So the idea of the rule of the people occurred.
Yeah, but the Athenians were Westerners.
Yeah, okay. So Athenian democracy is Western democracy. Westminster democracy is Western democracy. But the idea of democracy itself, okay, it's a Greek word, rule of the people. Yeah. However, rule of the people occurred in many different ways in many different parts of the world prior to Athenians demonstrating those votes, right? So within Africa, for example, even with the confederacies of South African, within South Africa that we have known today, when you had Zulus and the Songas and all the various different tribes, and you had the Kosis, who were the chiefs of those tribes, there was elements of democracy within that, where the tribal chiefs would meet up together and make votes and rules on things that happen, right?
So modern democracy is not that different from African ideology.
100%. That's the point.
So you could use
democracy, definitely.
Ideologies similar to the West.
100%. 100%. Yeah. But I think it makes more sense for us to relate them to the culture of that nation itself and to just import Western ideas directly to those areas.
Well, sure, you can't just use them the same way they were used in the West because the situation is different.
That's it.
But still, you can use the same template to create something that applies to your people. You know what I mean? I guess that could be a solution. So yeah, man, good talk.
Good conversation, man. Take care, yeah? And also Tywin Lannister. Lannister.
Yes.
No,
Yes.
No. House Stark all the way. Even though House Stark. But Tywin, I would agree with you. In terms of Realpolitik, Tywin Lannister is the perfect example of Realpolitik. Other than the fact he did not lead his household very well. He had his son.
He was the best.
He had his son.
Man.
He had his son Stephen. I mean, in terms of succession and all of that, he wasn't watching it very well, was he? I mean,
what could he do, man? He was managing the country. He couldn't watch his children and
that's where he dropped the ball. That's where he dropped the ball.
Yeah, his stupid son.
He should have took a second wife and let the wife control the household, and maybe that sort of stuff might not have happened. To be fair,
yeah, I guess.
Dodgy stuff, but yeah, no.
He was keeping the place in order.
Have you read the books, or just the series? Okay. In the series, definitely he is in control. In the books, there's a few other characters who I might put across as better politicians when it comes to power than Tywin. But Tywin is definitely a good example. But he's morally corrupt. But that's a liberal issue. He drowned the whole cast of the people just to get the leaders of the house. So it's pretty bad.
Did you see what Daenerys did?
We're not even going to get into that. That broke my heart.
Just because the Starks want to play the goody two-shoes doesn't mean that's how it worked. Look at the Boltons.
Yeah, for sure.
Look at the Greyjoys. Yeah. Look at the Thraki men, for God's sake. The worst of the worst, like savages who rape, pillage, and kill everyone.
For sure.
It's a very ruthless world.
Yeah, we gotta support those guys.
And Starks would not be able to manage that ruthless
100%.
world.
And that's why I definitely do think Tywin was a much better and effective leader because he understood the world that he was in.
Well, exactly.
And he didn't want, and that's the liberal, realist point of view in the world, in international relations,
liberal,
right? But I'm not the liberal. I'm talking about the liberal, realist paradigm in terms of international relations. On one side, you have the realists who say we have to deal with the world as it is. On the other side, you have the liberals who try and imagine, like Ned Stark style, a world based on honor where everyone's doing the right thing. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, of course it would be nicer if Ned Stark was in charge and everybody listened to him, but it just wouldn't happen. If he was in charge, he would probably get betrayed by Baelish or by the Boltons or
100%.
By anyone.
So you do need to have some of
too
that
naive to rule.
Machiavellian politics too.
Yeah, kind of. You need to adapt to a cruel world.
Yeah, for sure.
Can't just expect it to go nice. But yeah, anyway.
See you in a bit.
From your community.
Man, say it straight. Man, don't listen to BBC. Man, don't listen to ITV.
Mob rule.
What is that cigarette?
Mob rule. It's maybe my accent. Like being
Mob rule.
Yeah.
Oh no. Oh yeah, it's alright.
Derisive comment.
Mob rule.
But
No, I don't mean that. No. What I mean is, so generally, I think there's a misconception about what democracy is in this country, at least. We'll stick within the national boundaries. You've asked me. Sorry, you've asked me already, and I have to say no again. In this country, at least, people. You're a bit colder than me. You look cold. Anyway. So when you go to most people and ask them, hey, what's democracy? People tell you, oh, it's the ability to vote every 4 years, 4 or 5 years.